first question that I've asked myself, of course, you've been in the company for decades, director of philosophy for 9 years, if I'm correct. So,
Yes.
so maybe could you describe real quickly what's your role? And I'm interested also in what you've learned specifically in this last period of time.
Yeah. Well, the what we call the Patagonia philosophies go back to the late 80s, early 90s. And we had a period, we've had several periods of very strong growth. And to some extent, they're more challenging for our values than any other time. Uh, and in the 80s, I think we were without direction. So we were sales were increasing 40 to 50% a year, but we were adding new lines like crazy. At one point, we had 3 sailing lines for different classes of boats. We had a line for horseback riding. There were periods when people would, anybody you talked to on the plane who was interesting, you'd hire them, to come to work the next week. And I think that Yvon, at a certain point, started to wonder, am I creating a company that I don't want to own or I don't want to come to work for every day? And so he started to gather employees, about 30 at a time, in some remote place like Yosemite, and we'd sit outside in a circle and hash out how is it we want to do business, what do we believe in. The and he took people by function, by business function. So the finance people went together, the marketing, the sales, operations, HR, etc. And we came up with these documents that I edited them and put them together in a little internal booklet in 1991, and they became the heart of Let My People Go Surfing 15 years later when you all published that book. And one of the things I think that's interesting is that when we formulated these philosophies at a time when we were growing very rapidly, but we finished at a time when we were suffering because we overextended ourselves. We had borrowed way, the banks were throwing money at us and we took it. And when the recession of after the Berlin Wall fell, and American aerospace industry collapsed in Los Angeles and the banks got in trouble, and then we got in trouble with the bank. And so we finished writing these philosophies at a time when in 1991, we actually laid off 20% of our employees, contracted quite a bit. We didn't, the sales didn't contract entirely, but we didn't have the growth rate that we've been having, so we ended up with too much inventory, etc. So, and Guillaume used to teach classes for several years. He would do it seminar style, 10 or 12 people. And then he stopped. He got tired of it. And so when I retired from operational responsibilities about 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to teach the classes. And the environment was so different from when you all taught them, because we've had all of these things written down for decades now. Because I worked for the company for 20 years before we had anything written down, and everything was always up for question. And I think it's something I would advise any company that wants to live according to its values to be really careful about writing things down, because it really helps in the absence of individual discussions. Our employees always really took to heart, okay, what does this mean for my job? How does this play out in my work? And so what I did with the classes was to do something similar. And I would take people not by function, but I would have accountants and childcare providers and salespeople in the same room and have them talk about, okay, this is a value the company holds that I may share, but it makes my job so much harder.
Mm.
or it inspires me to come to work, and that's the reason I work. So that's kind of the background. And then I work about a third of the time internally with employees, and about a third of the time with graduate students. Had a relationship with Yale for 10 years between the environmental and the business schools. And then about a third of the time with B Corps, the B Corp movement, and 1% for the planet. Businesses that look up to Patagonia, or they want to operate according to their values. It's a long answer to your question, but I hope it answers other questions.
Yes, perfectly. And it's extraordinary that you write such a piece that it becomes, what it became. But I'm always wondering, like, when you do this exercise, is it something that is set in stone forever, or does it evolve? Do you let it grow? How do you manage that through so much time, for so long?
I think it has to change, but it changes more. If you do a good job, I think it changes more slowly than you would expect. So, for instance, the design philosophy that we described in 1991, and rather than lay out dicta about do this, do that, we made it 19 questions. Is the product long lasting? Is it durable? Does it perform as intended for its use? And one of the things we noticed maybe 25 years after we wrote that is we had nothing about repairability. And that's now a very strong design value for us because it really limits the durability of a product. So yes, I think everything has to be re-examined periodically. But I think that if you do a good job, the basic values will hold for a long time. We had a purpose statement that lasted for 27 years, and then we finally decided this isn't enough. And we feel very differently, and we want to simplify it. So the purpose statement for 27 years was build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, and use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Very complicated. And then we changed it to we're in business to save our home planet. And to my shock, because the first mission statement was something everybody took so much to heart. It was something that wasn't quite true when we adopted it. We didn't know enough about the supply chain to really reduce the harm we were doing. But it's something that we came to embody over those 27 years. And then the new language also seemed to me, oh, this is so aspirational for a clothing company to say we're in business to save our home planet. But there again, I think people ask within the company, they say, how does this affect the work of my team? How do we change what we do to embody this?
So that means that after that, you had to really adapt this very bright philosophy to in a very detailed way, so so everybody can go back and look at it.
Yeah, and we wrote about this in the book. The needs of businesses, of any business, 99% of all that a business does is shared by every business. We have more in common with ExxonMobil than we do in a way with a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think what has been experimental for us is to continue to function, to be strong as a business, and yet really question everything we do in a business that creates some harm, and figure out ways to reduce that. Give you an example, though. I love this. There's a woman who was in charge of events for Patagonia, and she was talking about our trade show booth. And she said, okay, all of her counterparts at other companies just change their booth every 2 years. and they didn't worry about it. You know, it's just whatever the marketing needs were, the needs of the time, and the budget was. Where she has to keep it for 10 years, and everything has to be recyclable. There's a strong aesthetic value that it has to be, and whenever she changes the trade show booth, it has to be, everything has to be recycled. So those constraints force everyone to think. And I think it also becomes business model. It inspires a different kind of business model, because you are looking for efficiencies, but primarily you're looking for ways to do things better. So you can't fall asleep. You can't say, okay, I don't worry about this.
Mm.
I have 10 problems here and 20 problems over here that are solved for the time being. I'm not going to care about that. You can't do that in the company.
So, and you mentioned knowledge, which is a key factor. There's so many companies out there that are claiming we do this, but then when you deep dive into it, there's nothing to back it up. So how did you organize in terms of a company to really make sure that everything you were standing for was something strong and backed by evidence that no one could, counter?
Well, I think that that's an ongoing, I don't think that question is ever settled. To give you an example, so we set a goal, maybe in 2017 or something like that we were going to be carbon neutral by 2025.
Mhm.
And so that was the goal. But we realized that carbon neutrality is a fairly easy goal. All you do is you buy a lot of credits, and then you're home free. But it doesn't really reduce the emissions, or it doesn't really help the environment. So we changed that. We said, okay, we know that 80% of our environmental impact is in materials, in the fabrics used. So we're going to commit to using no virgin oil in materials by 2025. And we got there this year. We don't use virgin oil, and all of the polyester and nylon is 100% recycled. But the emissions aren't down enough, because the real emissions, the factories or the mills that make the fabrics still use coal to fire their plants, because they're in Asia. So now it's a question, how do we work with the mills to convert them, to help them to convert to renewable energy, to wind and solar? The mills are so much bigger than we are, and they have many, many customers. So, if you're actually really working on problems and not just trying to say you're working on them, the problems change. They in a way, they almost get bigger every few years. So I think concentrating on the objectives, and then questioning the objectives, are they enough? Have we done enough? That has kept us more or less honest. I think the other thing is that we have this, we're on a pedestal. We're so well regarded and trusted that we're very conscious about that if we don't live up to that, we're going to be a big target. So I think that that's also influences the way we behave.
And you mentioned it, like if you have to take the whole chain into consideration when you want to be real for that. So, and it raised the issue of being systemic, and not all of the companies wants to have that level of intricity and commitment with their suppliers and everything. So, how do you cope with that? How do you make sure that it's a big burden in some way that you have to, so how do you cope with that as a company, at a company level?
I don't know quite how to answer. I think it's there are a couple of approaches. One thing I described to you about trade shows is an indication that's something that probably, the environmental impact of a trade show booth is nothing compared to everything else we've learned. So I think there are a couple of things we do. One is to look for constantly really get hard information on what you're doing and what's being done in the supply chain. So if companies avoid that, if they don't want to know what their suppliers are doing, there's no way they can really address those problems because they're invisible. That was true of us until we started down this path. So I think that right now we look at two things primarily. One is we're looking at what are the largest impacts. So if we say so much of our environmental impact is in fabrics that we have to deal with. But we also look holistically at all our practices. And that's something the B-Lab impact assessment is very helpful because it looks at everything from the recycling you do to the comparison of pay between the CEO and the lowest paid employee. All of these things factor in. So it's almost like in a traditional family, the father is looking at the big things that have to be done theoretically, and the mother who is valued as much can never stop working. If the kid is crying while she makes dinner, she's still making dinner and she's still dealing with the conflict. So both of those perspectives, I think, are really necessary in business. You cannot put problems to sleep because when they wake up, they come up behind you.
But you still do have to prioritize, right? Because
and that's the role, I think, of looking at, okay, what are the major products we need to develop? What are our major environmental and social challenges? But in the day-to-day work, the 3,000 people working for Patagonia, not all of them are concerned with the big problems. They're concerned with whatever it is they're tasked to do. And you want to make it possible for those people to be as proactive as possible and to have as much support as possible. And they say, hey, this is, the garment tags that we're putting on here are using bad inks. I can change this. So it's a matter of supporting rather than creating barriers for the people in the middle at the lower end who can make those kinds of decisions.
And one other topic that you mentioned really quickly, you mentioned B Corp movement, but you were also part of Fairtrade USA, Footprint, many others. And I think it teaches something as well, but I wanted to have your take on it. Like, you have to work in a systemic way. There's no way you can do this on your own. So when did you realize that, and how did you put that into motion?
I think the education for us was more in labor than on the environmental side. Because we're a clothing company primarily, if we have clothes made in factories, those factories are making clothes for a number of other brands. So the same labor conditions that apply to us are applying to those other brands. Under US law, you can't collaborate with the other brands, but you can work with an NGO that we helped start the Fair Labor Association that started to look at social issues. So that would be around in the 1990s, we started to look at cooperation. And then we also have worked on certifications for down and wool, for shared practices or industry-wide practices for animal welfare. And those have been kind of tough. I think we've established these standards that are even difficult for us to meet. And so we haven't had a lot of other people climb on. But I think they've raised the standard that other people use.
Mm-hmm. And are you going back when you set those standards, when you set your new priorities? when you do this type of work, are you referring back to the core philosophy, or is it something that is so attached to what everybody's doing that it's not necessary?
Yeah, I think it's more attached to what everybody's doing.
Mm.
Sometimes people will go back to um, the core philosophies, or they'll go back to let my people go surfing with a responsible company and say, okay, how do I act in the spirit of this? But for the most part, I think it's ingrained in what people do. Give you an example. When we outgrew our warehouse, we only had one warehouse in the U.S. We knew we needed one on the East Coast. And so our finance people and our operations people were driving around with real estate agents. And the real estate agents are showing them raw farmland to put up a 30,000 square meter warehouse. And they said, oh, we can't, they get together at the end of the day. They said, we can't do this. This is not in keeping with what we do. So it's nobody from the environmental side of the company was telling them that. It was something that was really ingrained. So we located that warehouse on a reclaimed coal mine, line that had been land that had been damaged in a mining accident 60 years ago and reclaimed. So that's the kind of thing, I think, that's an example of something that permeates the whole company. So there.
And a couple of last questions, but one is obviously what's you the most proud of since all these years you spent in Patagonia? I know you had a couple of breaks. You didn't spend your entire career.
Yeah.
Yeah, but most of it.
I think there were two things. One is that I was sales manager for a very long time, and then when I left that, I worked for the company on the catalogs, and I ended up working with a nonprofit in Maine to take out a dam that blocked 17 miles of spawning grounds for all of these ocean-going fish. And the dam was basically a tax dodge for its owner. It only provided 1/10 of 1% of the electricity for a city of 40,000 people, and did all this damage to the fish. The owners didn't want to give up the tax break, so I got together at 6 o'clock every morning on the phone with the people who worked on it, and I wrote several full-page ads for New York Times and Washington Post, and we got the first dam removed against the wishes of its owner. The fish have come back. The river has opened up. The birds have come back to the river, because it's been cleaned up. So I'm very proud of that.
You should. And the last question this time is really about during giving the current state of the world, the environment, and the trajectories that the scientists are giving us. How do you stay, if not positive, at least feel that sense of conquer that you need when you address those topics? How do you cope with that? What are your secrets?
I don't think so. I think one of the things that's helpful is that we've built up a culture of various successes. We've been able to change practices that we couldn't have thought we could do. And that builds a level of confidence for an organization as well as it does for a person. So that level of confidence is there, or that level of, okay, it's almost like an athlete. Okay, I can run this fast. I want to beat my time next time. That permeates the culture in terms of improving social and environmental practices. And it works against despair. I think the company is made up of some people are optimists and some people are pessimists, but primarily everybody has a sense of agency, that there's something that they can do. And they're supported in doing that, and they're able to support their families. So it's not a question of I would love to do that, but I won't be able to eat. people feel that they have a community, they have support, they have work, and that they can bring their values to work in the morning.
Right, Vincent, I have so much question, but we agreed on stopping here. So
Yeah,
I will not go further, but thank you so much
no,
again.
sure. Well, good luck with your work. So,
Thank you.
and your new career. That's great. So,
Thank